September 2nd, 1940. HMS Illustrious is 11 days into her first Mediterranean deployment. Somewhere south of Sardinia, a radar operator aboard the carrier picks up contacts. 4 Italian Savoia-Marchetti SM.79 torpedo bombers approaching at low altitude on a bearing that puts them on course for the fleet. The range is approximately 50 miles. Below the flight deck, a fighter direction officer plots the position on a board, calculates the heading, and lifts a radio handset. The pilots of number 806 Naval Air Squadron, already airborne on standing patrol, are already at 18,000 feet, well above the Fulmars' rated service ceiling of 27,200 feet, but held there deliberately, because the aircraft's dive bomber structural heritage means it can manage speed in a steep descent in ways that other fighters can't. The FDO's call gives them a vector, an altitude estimate, and a bearing. 2 miles of vertical separation between the Fulmars and the SM-79s, which are flying at roughly 200 feet above the water, close enough to the surface to stay beneath detection for as long as possible. The standard approach profile for a torpedo attack on warships. The Italians don't know anyone is above them. The radar and the 6 minutes it bought changed that. What happens next is determined by geometry. The Fulmars roll out and dive. The SM-79s are below and ahead, flying formation, their crews watching for the fleet they're approaching rather than the sky above. At close range, at high speed in the dive, a single firing pass from 8.303-inch Browning machine guns, 4 per wing, 750 rounds per gun, is enough. Italian naval aircraft of the period were often lightly constructed, with wooden framing in the fuselage and wing structures that concentrated weight savings in ways that also concentrated vulnerability. All 4 SM-79s are destroyed. Later that same afternoon, a Cant Z-501 flying boat adds itself to the tally. 5 kills in a single afternoon. The aircraft type had been in frontline service for 14 weeks. You've probably never heard of it. That isn't rhetorical setup. The fairy Fulmar genuinely doesn't appear in most air war histories, has no dedicated museum exhibit most visitors notice, and hasn't received documentary coverage proportionate to what it actually did. The kill record is real. 112 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed across 5 years of war, making it the Fleet Air Arm's highest-scoring fighter type of the entire Second World War. More kills than the Corsair in Royal Navy service, more than the Sea Hurricane, more than the Sea Fire. The Fulmar was Britain's primary carrier fighter through the most dangerous period on the most dangerous sea, the Mediterranean from 1940 to 1942, when the survival of Malta and the outcome of the North African campaign both depended on whether a convoy could get through. The title of this video calls it the plane that ruled the Mediterranean. That requires immediate qualification, because the word is doing considerable work. The Fulmar didn't achieve air superiority the way a Spitfire achieved it over southern England. It was slower than most opponents it faced, and pilots who flew it called it, among other things, an absurd lumbering thing of a so-called fighter. Sent briefly to the Pacific in 1942, it was outclassed by Japanese aircraft within days. What the Fulmar actually did was hold a line that had to be held during 2 years when Britain had nothing better to put on its carrier decks in the Mediterranean. That's more accurate than ruled, and it's a more honest story. It's also, as it turns out, a more interesting one. The aircraft traces its origins to a failed bomber project. In 1936, Fairey Aviation began developing the P-4/34 as a replacement for the Fairey Battle light bomber, responding to an Air Ministry specification. The Royal Air Force didn't want it. They selected the Hawker Henley, which was converted almost entirely into a target tug and barely saw combat as anything. But Fairey already had 2 working prototypes flying from their Great West Aerodrome facility on land that now lies under the runways of Heathrow Airport. When the Fleet Air Arm issued specification 0.8/38 in early 1938, calling for a 2-seat carrier monoplane capable of fleet defence and observation, Fairey's fastest viable path to a qualifying design was to navalise what they already had. Folding wings were fitted, an arrestor hook was added, naval radio equipment went in. A second cockpit was installed behind the pilots. That second cockpit explains almost everything that followed. The Fleet Air Arm required an observer because carrier pilots conducting extended missions over open ocean needed someone dedicated to navigation, position reporting by wireless telegraphy, and the kind of situational awareness a single pilot managing a combat aircraft under combat stress couldn't reliably maintain alone. Henry Hank Adlam, a Fleet Air Arm pilot who flew the Fulmar and wrote about it with characteristic directness, captured the trade-off precisely. The observer could only sit inside there like a prune while his pilot got on with the combat. Although, to be fair, it would be he who would find their way back to the carrier after the fight. The requirement made operational sense in the late 1930s. The weight and drag of the second crew position held the Fulmar's top speed to 265 miles per hour in the Mark I, powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin 8 developing 1,035 horsepower. The improved Mark II, fitted with the Merlin 30 at 1,300 horsepower, pushed that to 272 miles per hour at 7,250 feet. Substantially slower than the Bf-109E and closer in level flight speed to some of the bombers it needed to intercept than any fighter designer would have wanted. 8.303-inch Browning machine guns, 4 per wing, with ammunition loads of 750 to 1,000 rounds per gun, depending on the mark. The same calibre as the British infantry rifle round. The same as the early Hurricane and Spitfire at their introduction. Against lightly built aircraft at close range, the volume of fire from 8 guns was effective. Against more heavily armoured opponents at longer range, it demanded sustained passes that left the Fulmar exposed. Test pilot Peter Twiss, who flew Fulmars on convoy escort from HMS Ark Royal, described one engagement against Italian Fiat CR-42 biplane fighters. "I was turning as tight as the Fulmar allowed and taking shots whenever possible. Both CR-42s were badly damaged and one Italian pilot bailed out." He added the honest assessment: "There was no doubt that a Fulmar on its own would have been in trouble. However, the Italians didn't press their attack, fortunately for us." What it replaced in Mediterranean service was the Gloucester Sea Gladiator, a biplane. 600 Fulmars were built at Fairey's Stockport factory between the first production aircraft's maiden flight on January 4, 1940, from Royal Air Force Ringway near Manchester, and the delivery of the last airframe on December 11, 1942. The production line closed, and that was the type's entire manufacturing history. No more were ordered. HMS Illustrious arrived in the Mediterranean on August 22, 1940, bringing number 806 Naval Air Squadron and 12 Fulmars to a theatre that had been defended until that point largely by Sea Gladiators from HMS Eagle. Admiral Cunningham, the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean, had been explicit in communications to the Admiralty about the inadequacy of biplane air defence. Now he had a monoplane, and more importantly, he had radar. Illustrious was among the first British carriers fitted with shipborne radar, and her fighter direction officers had developed procedures for vectoring aircraft onto incoming raids before those raids appeared visually from the deck. The tactic the Fulmars used was counterintuitive. Loiter at altitude well above their rated ceiling and dive on incoming attackers from above. The light bomber structural heritage meant the Fulmar could manage its speed in the dive. The Italian aircraft approaching at low altitude to attack ships couldn't match the geometry. Italian designs of the period, the SM-79, the Cant Z-501, were often wood-framed and lightly constructed. 8.303 caliber guns in a single fast-diving pass at close range were enough to destroy them. By October 1940, Fulmar pilots had claimed 10 Italian bombers destroyed. By January 1941, Illustrious's fighters had confirmed 26 aircraft shot down in total since the carrier's arrival. During those months, the Mediterranean fleet achieved something it had not previously managed: consistent local air superiority over the central convoy routes, the lanes along which Malta was being supplied and through which Cunningham's warships needed to operate freely. In Wings of the Navy, his book examining Allied carrier aircraft of the Second World War, Captain Eric Brown described the Fulmar's Mediterranean debut with the precision of a man who had spoken directly with the pilots involved. The timing, he argued, was propitious. Italian bombers flying convoy attack profiles were exactly the opponents the Fulmar's combination of altitude geometry and radar direction could neutralize, and the Fulmar pilots did so voraciously. November 1940 brought the Battle of Taranto. Fulmars from Illustrious provided top cover during the Swordfish torpedo attack on the Italian battle fleet at anchor, the operation that demonstrated, for the first time in history, that carrier aircraft could neutralize a battle fleet in harbour. The Fulmars didn't execute the attack. Their job was to stay overhead and prevent Italian fighters from reaching the Swordfish, while the slow biplanes made their runs into the harbour mouth. Without that cover, the Swordfish casualty rate would have been considerably higher. The contribution was less photogenic than torpedo bombers flying at mast height into Taranto harbour, but it was structurally necessary to the operation's success. Then the Luftwaffe arrived. In January 1941, Germany transferred Fliegerkorps 10 to Sicily, a specialist anti-shipping formation with Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, Ju-88 level bombers and torpedo aircraft, flown by crews who had spent years rehearsing precision attacks on ships at sea. They were faster than Italian aircraft, more robustly constructed, better coordinated, and operating with a tactical understanding of how to overwhelm a carrier's fighter defences that the Italian Regia Aeronautica had not demonstrated. The challenge wasn't just harder, it was categorically different. The Fulmars did what they could. It wasn't enough to stop the attack. Illustrious was badly damaged by German bombing and forced to withdraw from the Mediterranean for extended repair. In the months that followed, fighter direction procedures were re-examined and refined, communication systems were improved, and the Admiralty began the urgent work of finding more aircraft for the Mediterranean fleet. HMS Formidable arrived from the Red Sea in March 1941 to replace her, carrying number 803 and number 806 squadrons. She entered the highest operational tempo the fleet air arm had sustained. On March 28th, during the Battle of Cape Matapan, 13 Fulmars from Formidable participated in a coordinated action against the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto. The Fulmars strafed the battleship, specifically to draw her anti-aircraft fire away from the Fairey Swordfish and Albacore torpedo bombers attacking simultaneously. The Vittorio Veneto was hit by at least one torpedo and damaged. She reached Taranto under her own power and survived the war. The Fulmars provided suppression and diversion at Matapan and contributed to a genuine tactical success. They didn't sink a capital ship. Nothing in the available record supports any stronger claim than that, and any account that makes one isn't reliable. The operational statistics for April 18th to May 12th, 1941 are the most precisely documented numbers in the Fulmars' wartime record. They exist because a commander in the middle of a desperate supply crisis put them in a telegram to the First Sea Lord. In 24 days, 18 Fulmars flew 390 total sorties, 338 of those classified as fighter patrols. They made 25 interceptions and confirmed 15 enemy aircraft destroyed, with 5 more probables. The Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean sent that telegram on May 13th. I must again urge the necessity of immediate increase in the supply of FAA fighters. At that moment, the Eastern Mediterranean held 15 serviceable Fulmars, with 14 more under repair or overhaul. The minimum needed to maintain meaningful coverage, Cunningham calculated, was 3 full squadrons of 12 aircraft each, plus a reserve of 36 more. The First Sea Lord's minute of May 26th mapped where every available Fulmar in the world was. 5 aboard Formidable, 5 at Malta, 15 on passage from the United Kingdom, 10 packed and ready to ship, several dozen more in training establishments and repair yards. For a carrier fleet covering the entire Eastern Mediterranean in the middle of an intensive air campaign, it wasn't enough, and both men knew it. May 8th, 1941 was the single most successful day in the type's operational history. Aircraft from HMS Ark Royal and HMS Formidable together claimed 6 Italian and 8 German aircraft, 14 confirmed kills, for the loss of 2 Fulmars. Number 803 and number 806 squadrons combined ultimately accounted for 56 of the Fulmars' confirmed wartime kills, nearly half the type's total score, accumulated over approximately 8 months of Mediterranean operations from 2 carriers. HMS Ark Royal, operating as part of Vice Admiral Somerville's Force H from Gibraltar, ran Malta convoys through the Western Mediterranean throughout 1941. Number 807 and number 808 squadrons, her Fulmar units, added 30 more confirmed kills before Ark Royal was torpedoed by U-81 on November 13, 1941, and sank the following morning. During Operation Substance in July 1941, the Fulmars of Ark Royal repeatedly broke up Italian torpedo bomber attacks on the convoy. On July 23rd, 2 formations were intercepted, with 2 enemy aircraft shot down and 2 probable kills, the survivors turning back before reaching the merchant ships. On July 25th, a torpedo bomber attack was completely dispersed before any aircraft reached the fleet. 4 enemy planes were confirmed destroyed, with 2 more damaged. All bombs and all torpedoes were jettisoned into empty water. Somerville's formal report included a line that has outlasted the operation itself. One Italian airman shot down and rescued stated in his account of what had happened that he had been intercepted by a hurricane. Somerville concluded from this that it was evident that the enemy hold our fleet air arm fighters in higher esteem than do our own Fulmar pilots. The Italian pilot, attributing his defeat to a higher performance aircraft than the one that actually shot him down, had inadvertently provided the most precise measure available of how the Fulmar was performing against opponents who didn't know what they were facing. In May 1941, briefly, the Fulmar operated in entirely different waters. During the hunt for the German battleship Bismarck, 6 Fulmars from HMS Victorious were used as carrier-borne spotters, tracking the Bismarck's movements by wireless, while Victorious's Swordfish torpedo bombers mounted their attack. It was exactly the mission the two-seat configuration had been designed for: long-range navigation and wireless operation over the North Atlantic at night in deteriorating weather, while simultaneously managing an aircraft. 2 of the 6 Fulmars became lost in heavy weather and darkness and were forced to ditch in the ocean. 3 maintained contact long enough to provide usable position data. The observer's presence in that second seat had earned its cost that particular night, and everyone who survived it knew it. May 26, 1941. Removed Formidable from the theatre. During operations off Crete, the carrier was struck by 2 bombs from German aircraft and forced to withdraw to Alexandria for repair. Her Fulmar squadrons went ashore in Egypt and continued operating from land bases. For several months that summer, with Illustrious and Formidable both out of action, the Eastern Mediterranean Fleet operated largely without carrier air cover. The reprieve came from an unexpected direction. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 drew Luftwaffe units from Sicily eastward to support operations on the Eastern Front. Against Italian aircraft operating without German support, the Fulmar could again function on the terms of 1940. Number 803 Squadron, operating in Syria and Lebanon from shore bases after Formidable's withdrawal, flew the Fulmar against Vichy French aircraft during the Syria-Lebanon campaign that summer. Sub-Lieutenant Jackie Sewell became the first Fleet Air Arm pilot to score 5 confirmed kills in the Fulmar during the Mediterranean operations, making him the type's first ace. Sub-Lieutenant Stanley Orr, one of 806 Squadron's early pilots, finished the war with 12 confirmed victories, the 3rd highest score of any Fleet Air Arm pilot in the entire conflict, having built the foundation of that record while flying the Fulmar in the Mediterranean during its most intense operational period. Most Fleet Air Arm fighter aces of the war scored at least some of their victories in Fulmars. The aircraft was simply the machine that was available during the years when the most enemies were being shot down. By August 1942, the day fighter role had been substantially taken over by faster aircraft. Sea Hurricanes and Grumman Martlets were handling fleet interceptions, and the Fulmars were assigned to roles where endurance and stability mattered more than rate of climb. 16 Fulmars from number 809 and number 884 squadrons, both aboard HMS Victorious, flew those roles during Operation Pedestal. The Convoy, 13 modern merchant ships plus the American-owned tanker Ohio, sailed from the River Clyde on August 2, 1942, carrying 42,000 tons of food, fuel and ammunition to beleaguered Malta. The escort assembled around it was the largest yet assembled for a Mediterranean convoy. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers and 32 destroyers. The air group brought 46 Hurricanes, 10 Grumman Martlets and those 16 Fulmars. The Fulmars were assigned low-altitude coverage specifically against torpedo bombers, the role that suited their stability and endurance. The faster single-seat aircraft handled the interception and top cover roles. This was the Fulmar performing the function it was most suited to, late in its operational life, knowing it was a secondary asset in an air group it had once led. The convoy entered the Mediterranean through the Gibraltar Strait at dawn on August 9th. For the first 2 days, the enemy kept back. The men aboard the convoy ships cleaned weapons, ate hurried meals, and waited. Captain Dudley Mason, commanding the tanker Ohio, had briefed his volunteer crew in the petty officers' mess before sailing. Malta has for some time been in great danger. It's imperative that she be kept supplied. He said it quietly. His crew already knew what the Mediterranean meant for ships in convoy. August 11th was when it started. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Helmut Rosenbaum, commanding U-73, loosed 4 torpedoes at HMS Eagle from beneath the destroyer screen. All 4 struck. Eagle, launched in 1918, completed as a carrier in 1923, a ship that had dispatched 183 Spitfires to Malta in the previous year, toppled on her side and sank in 8 minutes. 260 of her crew were lost. 3 squadrons of her aircraft, ready for takeoff, cascaded overboard as the carrier rolled. The Fulmars aboard Victorious kept flying through the day that followed and the day after that. They were providing low-level cover on August 11th when Italian torpedo bombers swept in at 100 feet above the water. On August 12th, when 29 Stukas put 3 severe hits on HMS Indomitable and disabled her flight deck, the remaining carrier air groups absorbed the load that Indomitable's squadrons could no longer carry. That evening, 2 Italian submarines struck the convoy again, hitting the cruiser Nigeria, the cruiser Cairo, and the tanker Ohio in rapid succession. Cairo had to be scuttled. Ohio, with 2 torpedoes in her side and her steering gear destroyed, dropped behind the convoy in the darkness. Through the sustained attacks that cost 3 cruisers and 9 merchant ships, the Fulmars claimed 9 enemy aircraft destroyed and lost 3 of their own. 4 merchant ships reached Malta on August 13th. Ohio, kept afloat for 2 more days by destroyers lashed alongside, her decks virtually awash, was finally coaxed into Valletta's Grand Harbour on August 15th. The island held. Pedestal was the Fulmar's last major carrier operation as a day fighter. No. 807 Squadron had already been withdrawn to re-equip with Seafires earlier that year. The replacement cycle was completing. The last Fulmar day fighter squadron was withdrawn from frontline service in March 1943. Starting in early 1942, approximately 100 Fulmar Mark IIs were converted to NF Mark II night fighter configuration. The specific operational cause was Italian torpedo bombers attacking the Mediterranean fleet after dark, outside the reach of day interceptors. The converted aircraft received Air Interception AI Mark X radar, which added weight and disrupted an aerodynamic profile that was already marginal. They were slower than the day variants. The Admiralty pressed them into service regardless, because an imperfect night interceptor was better than leaving the fleet undefended after dark. Night fighter Fulmars flew convoy escort operations from escort carriers until February 1945, when the last operational example, a night fighter from No. 813 Squadron aboard HMS Campania, was severely damaged in a barrier landing accident and written off. The type officially left frontline service that month, nearly 5 years after its debut. When Fulmars briefly engaged Japanese aircraft during the attack on Ceylon in April 1942, the result directly measured what the Mediterranean had obscured. 6 Fulmars were lost in exchange for 4 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 1 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber. The Mitsubishi Zero was faster, more manoeuvrable, and operating at a performance margin the Fulmar couldn't close, regardless of tactics. What the Mediterranean had provided, shipborne radar direction, altitude geometry, lightly built opponents, constrained attack approaches over flat water, the Indian Ocean didn't replicate. The aircraft was the same. The theatre was entirely different. Final wartime accounting. 112 enemy aircraft destroyed, 40 Fulmars lost to enemy action. Of those 40 losses, only 3 were in air-to-air combat against single-seat fighters, a 5-to-3 kill-to-loss ratio against single-seat opponents for an aircraft slower than every single-seat fighter it faced.
Most losses came from the defensive armament of the bombers the Fulmar was attacking, because the slow closing speed on stern approaches left its large radiator and 2-man cockpit exposed to return fire for longer than a faster aircraft would have needed. The Fleet Air Arm's highest fighter kill total for the entire war, more than double the Corsairs' total in Royal Navy service. Hushkit's aviation writers, reviewing the record years later, called it something of an anomaly, the highest-scoring naval fighter of the war being the relatively slow and staid Fairey Fulmar. That anomaly has a straightforward explanation. The Fulmar was where the fighting was, from the beginning, when the fighting was at its worst. Now, a necessary diversion, because a persistent mistake in footage and photographic archives has been propagating through coverage of this aircraft, and anyone who knows the Fleet Air Arm's wartime history will be watching for it. The Fairey Firefly and the Fairey Fulmar are frequently confused. The confusion is understandable on a superficial level and completely avoidable with minimal attention. Here is the distinction, stated simply. The Fulmar Mark I was armed with 8.303-inch Browning machine guns, 4 per wing, mounted flush inside the wing surface. The Firefly Mark I was armed with 4 20mm Hispano cannon, 2 per wing, with visible external cannon fairings that protrude beneath the wing surface and are visible in any reasonably clear photograph taken in flight or on the ground. These aren't similar armament configurations. The .303 caliber round is a rifle caliber cartridge. The 20mm cannon round is an explosive, destructive shell of a fundamentally different order. 8 rifle-caliber machine guns versus 4 20mm cannon isn't a subtle distinction. It represents a generational jump in anti-aircraft firepower, and it's the easiest single thing to look for when trying to identify which aircraft you're looking at. The two aircraft have other visual differences that make misidentification avoidable. The Fulmar used a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, comparatively slim and moderate in length, producing the characteristic profile of a 1940-era British fighter nose. The Firefly used a Rolls-Royce Griffon, a substantially larger engine, developing between 1,730 and 1,990 horsepower, depending on the variant, with a longer, more prominent nose cowl that changed the aircraft's whole silhouette from the front quarter. The Fulmar measured 40 feet 2 inches in length and weighed approximately 4.5 tons, fully equipped. The Firefly weighed over 7 tons, more than 50% heavier, and was visually a noticeably larger, more substantial machine. The wing shapes differ, the proportions differ. The underside of the wing tells the whole story immediately. Flush gun bays versus protruding cannon pods aren't hard to distinguish. The production timelines make any footage confusion even less defensible for anyone paying attention to dates. Fulmar production ran from January 1940 to December 1942, yielding 600 aircraft. The Firefly's first prototype didn't fly until December 1941. Production deliveries commenced in March 1943, 3 months after the last Fulmar rolled off the Stockport line. The first operational Firefly Squadron, number 1770 at Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton, received its initial aircraft on October 1, 1943, 7 months after the last Fulmar Dayfighter Squadron had been withdrawn from frontline service. By the time the Firefly was reaching frontline squadrons,
Fulmars were already out of the fleet fighter role. If footage is claimed to show a Fulmar in active Mediterranean carrier operations, and the aircraft in that footage has visible cannon fairings under its wings, it isn't a Fulmar, it's a Firefly. The dates alone rule out a Fulmar with Firefly-style cannon. Both aircraft were two-seat carrier monoplanes built by Fairey Aviation, both using Rolls-Royce engines, both carrying observers in the second seat for the same navigational reasons. The family resemblance was real, but the Firefly wasn't a modified Fulmar. Fairey's engineers built every component new, drew on what they'd learned, and produced a fundamentally different machine. The shared manufacturer and superficially similar configuration created the conditions for misidentification, and those conditions have appeared repeatedly in footage-heavy coverage of Fleet Air Arm history. The armament difference, 8 rifle-caliber guns versus 4 20mm cannon, is the fastest single check. If you see cannon fairings on the underwing, you aren't looking at a Fulmar. The man whose judgment on this aircraft carries the most authority in aviation history probably has a view, though exactly what he flew requires care in the stating. Captain Eric Brown flew 487 different aircraft types, the most of any pilot in recorded history, verified by the Guinness Book of World Records. Not 487 individual airframes, but 487 distinct types. Everything from open cockpit biplanes to captured German jet aircraft evaluated after the war, to the de Havilland Sea Vampire, in which he made the world's first carrier jet landing on December 3, 1945, aboard HMS Ocean. He made 2,407 carrier deck landings, a separate record. He was the Fleet Air Arm's most decorated pilot. Born in Edinburgh in 1919, he joined the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve as a Fleet Air Arm pilot and was designated a fighter pilot in August 1940. The same month, Illustrious was loading Fulmars in Scotland for her Mediterranean deployment. Brown acquired his nickname during Royal Navy service. The service had a tradition of nicknaming slightly built officers after the periwinkle, a small shellfish. Brown was 5 feet 7 inches tall, slight in build, and the nickname followed him from his early service to his death on February 21, 2016, aged 96. He was called Winkle by everyone who knew him and by most people who only knew of him. His wartime service has a specific, documented texture. Posted to number 802 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Audacity, the Royal Navy's first escort carrier, a converted merchant ship with a flat deck bolted on and no hangar, he flew convoy escort duties in the Battle of the Atlantic from the spring of 1941 onward. The FW-200 Condor, a 4-engine maritime patrol aircraft that hunted Atlantic convoys for German submarines, was the primary threat. Brown shot down 2 of them. His Distinguished Service Cross was awarded on March 10, 1942. He needed the past tense by then because HMS Audacity had been torpedoed by U-751 on December 21, 1941, and sunk. Brown was one of only 2 members of the ship's flight crew to survive. He was in the water for hours, in the North Atlantic in December, before rescue. After Audacity, he went to test flying, the career that would build the 487 type list. He tested captured German aircraft. He evaluated every significant Allied naval type that came through the system. He wrote about them with the precision of a man who measured aircraft the way a luthier measures instruments, by specific physical properties rather than by reputation. His assessment of the Fulmar, recorded in Wings of the Navy, was that the aircraft had innate soundness and competence. That is a specific choice of language. Not exceptional capability, not outstanding performance. soundness, and competence, the qualities that define a reliable tool rather than a remarkable one. From a man who had sat in the cockpits of nearly 500 different machines, that assessment carries specific meaning. He knew what structural integrity felt like and what it didn't. He knew the difference between an aircraft that was genuinely well engineered for its role and one that only appeared so. His broader commentary on the Fulmars' Mediterranean debut, that Italian bombers flying convoy attack profiles were exactly the opponents the Fulmars' radar direction and altitude geometry could neutralize, and that the Fulmar pilots exploited that match voraciously, reads as the assessment of someone who had spoken at length with the pilots who flew those missions and understood exactly what they had done and how. Whether Brown's 487 type list includes the fairy Fulmar as a type he personally flew is a question the available records don't conclusively settle. His compiled list of aircraft types, as documented in accessible sources, doesn't include the Fulmar among its confirmed entries. His operational career overlapped entirely with the Fulmar's frontline years, and it would be genuinely surprising if the most comprehensive multi-type aviator in history had somehow missed the Fleet Air Arm's primary carrier fighter of 1940 to 1942. But surprising isn't confirmation, and this script won't assert what the record doesn't establish. What it will assert is that Brown's commentary on the aircraft, in a book specifically about Allied carrier aviation, came from the most experienced naval aviator in history and should be read accordingly. The Fulmar's obscurity after the war has a structural explanation, and it runs deeper than the aircraft's speed limitations. The most important factor is geography, combined with the distribution of post-war publishing attention. The major naval air campaigns of the Pacific, Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, were enormous engagements fought by American carriers with American aircraft and American casualties, in a theatre where the United States was the primary combatant, and the United States Navy's photographic documentation program was unprecedented in scale and professional organization. American historians, American publishers, American documentary producers, and American museum curators had both the material and the institutional incentive to cover those operations extensively for decades afterward. The archive from the Pacific is simply larger. More film, more photographs, more official records, more veterans' memoirs published commercially, more museum acquisitions. The U.S. Naval Institute's Naval History magazine acknowledged the dynamic directly in a published essay. American neglect may result from the fact that the Mediterranean was an area primarily of British strategic concern. The Pacific War produced the canonical aviation imagery of the Second World War. The Mediterranean Carrier War didn't. The secondary factor is the Fleet Air Arm's position within British aviation history specifically. The Battle of Britain, fought by RAF Fighter Command, not by the Fleet Air Arm, became the defining British air story of the war, and appropriately so, given its significance. But the gravitational pull of that narrative drew popular aviation writing, documentary production, and museum emphasis toward the RAF, in ways that consistently underweighted what the Fleet Air Arm was simultaneously doing at sea. A doctoral thesis from Murdoch University, examining the history of Commonwealth Fleet Air Arm operations, noted directly that naval aviators have been contributing to military history since 1914, but they remain, the word the researcher chose was obscure, not underappreciated, obscure. The third factor is the stopgap framing that embedded itself in the literature almost from the moment the Fulmar was superseded. Multiple sources from the period onward describe it as a stopgap, the emergency measure bridging sea gladiators and the improved fighters that arrived from 1942 onward. One scholarly source characterises the fleet air arm filling a void with stopgaps such as the Fairy Fulmar. The word is accurate in a narrow procurement sense. The fleet air arm knew when they ordered it that better aircraft were in development, and the Fulmar was always understood as a transitional solution. What the stopgap framing misses is that the transition lasted 2 full years, covered the most operationally intense period the fleet air arm faced in the Mediterranean, and produced more confirmed kills than any other British carrier fighter type in the war. Stopgap describes the procurement timeline. It doesn't describe the operational contribution. The fourth factor is the simplest. The Fulmar was slow, and history's respect for Second World War aircraft is broadly proportional to speed first, armament second, and combat record a distant third. At 272 miles per hour, the Fulmar doesn't impress anyone who immediately compares it to the 362 mile per hour Spitfire Mark I or the 330 mile per hour Hurricane. 8.303 caliber guns sound light against the 20mm cannon armament that followed. The 112 kills aren't always easy to locate in the sources that spend most of their attention on those other metrics. So the aircraft disappears, and what remains visible in popular coverage are the armoured carriers it was defending. The Illustrious class, one of Britain's most significant wartime naval innovations. Written about at length, while the aircraft that flew from their decks during their most dangerous years earns a footnote. Number 809 Naval Air Squadron's pilots left their own assessment of the Fulmar in a verse written to the tune of Any Old Iron. Weighs 6 ton, no rear gun, damn all to rely on. You know what you can do with your Fulmar too. They flew it anyway. Day after day, over waters where the alternative was leaving the convoy undefended. One Fulmar survived. Serial number N1854 is the first production Fairy Fulmar, the aircraft that made its maiden flight on January 4, 1940, from Royal Air Force Ringway near Manchester, the day the production type formally entered the world. It was constructed at Fairy's Stockport factory with construction number F3707, the first off the line, the one used in early evaluation and service before production found its pace. It flew throughout the war years in various capacities, was eventually modified to Mark II standard, and after the Fulmar's withdrawal from service was civilianized, registered as GAIBE, and used by Fairy Aviation Company as a company hack aircraft, flying between facilities in the way that manufacturers' aircraft do when they've graduated from serious work to administrative utility. In June 1959, Fairy reverted the aircraft to its wartime service markings and donated it to the Royal Navy. 3 years later, N1854 appeared at the Society of British Aerospace Companies show at Farnborough on September 8, 1962, one of its last public appearances as a flying aircraft. The show photographs show the aircraft in its service markings, on the ground at Farnborough, looking more complete and purposeful than any aircraft that had spent the previous 17 years as a company runabout had any right to look. 3 months after Farnborough, on December 18, 1962, N1854 flew for the last time. It departed from Royal Naval Air Station Lossiemouth in Scotland. The station's official Royal Navy designation was HMS Fulmar. the last aircraft of the type to fly, left from the base named after it on a December day 17 years after the type's frontline withdrawal. Whether anyone present marked the coincidence isn't recorded. N1854 made its way to the Fleet Air Arm Museum at Royal Naval Air Station Yeovilton in Somerset, where it has been on static display in Hall 2 since the early 1970s.
The dossier notes it as the first exhibit you come to in Hall 2, the aircraft that greets you when you walk into that particular hall, before you've reached the Swordfish, before you've found the Sea Harrier, before you've worked out the geography of the space. The aircraft is 40 feet 2 inches long. Its Merlin engine sits in the nose, not the larger Griffon of the Firefly that replaced it, not the American power plants that arrived later, but the same basic engine family that was powering Spitfires and Hurricanes when No. 806 Squadron shot down 4 SM-79s south of Sardinia on the afternoon of September 2nd, 1940. The gun bays in the wings are empty now, but the apertures are there, 4 per wing, the exact positions where the .303 caliber Brownings sat during the years when this aircraft's type was accumulating 112 kills over the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic and the Arctic convoy routes. The Fleet Air Arm Museum at Yeovilton also holds the artefacts of Captain Eric Brown, his medals, his flying suit, the actual sea vampire in which he made the world's first carrier jet landing. Brown and the Fulmar share a building at Yeovilton. The most experienced multi-type aviator in history, and the aircraft type he described as having innate soundness and competence, occupy the same exhibition space, separated by a few dozen feet of museum floor. They don't have equal billing. The Sea Vampire display and Brown's record attract considerably more attention from visitors who arrive not already knowing what happened over the Mediterranean from 1940 to 1942. The Fulmar sits in the variety of quiet that museum aircraft achieve when the context isn't fully conveyed by the placard beside them. It was the Fleet Air Arm's highest-scoring fighter of the entire Second World War. It flew through the Battle of Taranto, the Hunt for the Bismarck, Cape Matapan, the Siege of Malta, Operation Pedestal, and the Mediterranean Convoy War from beginning to end. History doesn't distribute its attention according to what mattered. It distributes attention according to what was documented at scale, photographed by the dominant post-war power, and measured against performance metrics that favour fast single-seat fighters. The Fairy Fulmar fails 2 of those 3 tests. What it doesn't fail is the combat record, and the combat record is what this video has been about. 600 were built. 1 survives. It's in Hall 2 at Yeovilton, and it's been there for over 50 years. The sea it defended wasn't the ocean that produced the mythology. The pilots who flew it understood exactly what they had. Something slow, heavy, occasionally maddening, and absolutely necessary. And they flew it at the highest operational tempo the Fleet Air Arm faced during the years that mattered most. No. 809's pilots wrote their song about it, and then climbed back in and flew it over the Mediterranean until the convoys got through. The Fulmar wasn't glamorous, wasn't fast, and never sank a battleship. It was Britain's most available carrier fighter at the moment that mattered most, in the theatre where the strategic balance of the war was being decided, one convoy at a time. That's both accurate and enough. Subscribe for more stories told at this level of detail. There are Fleet Air Arm aircraft with records that deserve this treatment, and very few of them have had it.